meaningful fragility in your children, and it's beautiful. And maybe if you've been warped and hurt, you get resentful about it and jealous of it, and that can lead to all sorts of terrible things. But to the degree that you're privileged to see that calls you to be a better person. And you can think of that, biologically. Well, you have these fragile creatures that you're responsible for. Of course, that's going to call you to a higher mode of action, because otherwise they're not going to live, So it's very practical. But what you see there is if you view someone with love, then it's incumbent upon you to treat them as if they're valuable. And then the more you treat other people as if they're valuable, the better person you are. That just comes along for the ride in some sense. So none of that seems questionable to me. That seems solid. And so then maybe the more love you view other people with, the higher the moral demand that's placed on you. And then I would say too, well then, that's another reason why it's so important to be truthful and in some sense to be good, because it isn't obvious to me that you can withstand that moral load if you're compromised by too much sin. It's too much. And that's another thing that we're not very good at teaching young people about. You shouldn't do that. It's like there's a sanctimonious authority that goes along with that that's the wrong tone. It's more like, I don't know how you lay it out properly, but you tell people that you love how to avoid the road to hell. And you don't do that because you're shaking your finger at them or because you're a moral authority. You do it because you don't want them to burn. And I think there's too much of the moral authority still in the church and not enough of the love that helps people avoid the fire.
I think that what you just beautifully described is the unity of the love commandment, that you love God with all your heart and all your soul and all your mind, and you love your neighbor as yourself. Mm-hmm. The love of God identifies the pattern, and then that interplay between the love of the neighbor and the love of the self. They're differentiated but inextricably intertwined. And right. So to love the neighbor is to see the neighbor as he or she actually is, and to respond to the actuality, not to your desires, not to what you want this person to be in a utilitarian or instrumental sense, but to the reality of that eternal soul right there. And in and through that, then you see who you are.
And that's a commentary on the Ten Commandments, right? That's Christ's summation of the Ten Commandments. So that's another illustration of that abstraction. Proper behavior, the story on top of that, the propositions, that would be the Ten Commandments, let's say. So then Christ is challenged on the Ten Commandments, something like, rank order these if you're so wise. Yeah. Right? And right, exactly, because you're going to say something heretical. And Christ does this unbelievable sleight of mind and extracts out two superordinate principles. And it's done in such a compelling way that the interlocutor, who's basically a prosecutorial mind, like an inquisitionist in some sense, is reduced to silence. That's a very powerful story. It's one of those stories, you read that, you think, it's not obvious how someone could have made that up. There's a lot of genius. There's an immense well of moral genius in that story. And the idea that that's some sort of casual, false construct, produced for the purposes of power. It's like, well, you try to write a story that short, that is that wise. See how far you get with it. So,
yeah, and those stories are all over the Gospels. I mean, think about the story where the woman is caught in adultery, And they say to Jesus, well, the law says we should stone her to death. What do you say? And they're trying to trap him, of course, because if he says, well, don't stone her to death, then they say, well, you're against Moses, huh? You're a religious heretic. And then if he says, go ahead and throw the stones, then he's going against his message of mercy. But Jesus, of course, says very famously, let whoever has the first sin cast the first, or whoever has no sin cast the first stone. And, everyone has to drop their stones and go away.
Yeah.
And then he says to her, of course, go and sin no more. So that kind of story, you think, yeah, you'd have to have quite an imagination, be a kind of literary genius to come up with this. And I think it's important in part because Christ combines both, right? That is to say, we have the command, and the commandment, say, not to commit adultery, is there for a reason. I'm sure you know from your clinical practice that, that can cause unbelievable problems, for couples and families. But he also has the mercy. So Jesus combines the high commands of justice and with this high mercy. And in a way, that's what the church is seeking to do. Now, always imperfectly because we're imperfect, but both need to be there. There needs to be the the high moral calling, but also the great mercy, both. Because I think one without the other is going to be unbalanced.
And the high moral calling, again, is for our own good. The law is a form of grace. This is how we flourish. This is how we become happy. Now, of course, we fail, which brings in the mercy component. But that's another terrible misconstrual of religion broadly, and specifically Christianity and Catholicism, is that somehow these rules were premised on control or power as their motivating reason for coming into existence. It's the exact opposite. It's to liberate. It's to liberate us from ourselves.
I guess it's the other thing that seems to have worked in my lectures is like a lot of the work I've done was motivated by my attempts, I suppose, to understand hell. And then more than that, it's like, how is it that you become an active contributor to hell? And you might say, well, hell isn't real. Well, and I would say then, well, you haven't looked enough if you think that's true. You're fortunate enough so that you can believe that's not true. It's like you know nothing about history and you've been unbelievably sheltered in your own life if you don't believe that hell is real. And, maybe only someone cruel would wish that ignorance be stripped away from you. But if you study history as a perpetrator, well, then, if you study history, you believe in hell. And if you study history as a perpetrator, then you see how your own inequity contributes to that. And then it's not unreasonable to say, well, if you love people, you would try to guide them away from that. And when I did my Maps of Meaning lectures at the university and in public, that's always in the back of my mind. It's, well, look at what happened in Germany, and look at what happened in the Soviet Union, and look at what happened in China, and how do you act so that that happens? Well, I wouldn't make that happen. It's like, if you say that, then you would, because you don't know enough. Because if you do, you'd say, yes, I could contribute to that, and I probably am, and I should be terrified enough to stop if I only knew how. And then these guidelines to love and to tell the truth, they are, in fact, protection against exactly that kind of catastrophe.
Yeah, and I think it's true not only in those very dramatic examples of hell, like the Gulag, but I think it's true in a really everyday sense. I mean,
yes,
hell can start here on earth in a very everyday sort of way. So I think of somebody actually that I know on my block, and this person is incredibly angry at everyone, even people that try to help this person. She's always angry at them, and she's filled with hatred and bitterness, and everything's bad. And so for this person, I would say she is already living in hell, the beginning of hell, at least here on earth. I mean, her life, as far as I can tell, is just really, really hellish in every respect. And then people in contact with her, she makes their life hellish very often. And the reverse is true, too. There can be people here and now who are already living in the beginnings of heaven. They're filled with love for God. They're filled with love for other people. They love themselves. They're living this heavenly life because at the end of the day, at least on the Catholic view, what is heaven? Well, what heaven is perfect love of God, perfect love of other people, perfect love of yourself. And what is hell? What's the opposite of that? It's a lack of all that, right? It's lacking love of God, lacking love for other people, lacking love for yourself. It's being filled with hatred. So heaven and hell, I would say, really begin right now. And in the life to come, they say they're intensified, they're deepened. So, and this is the vision of Dante, right? That heaven or hell is something that all of its punishments are meant to show that the sin is its own punishment in some respect, right? All the punishments that say that people in hell experience are all a natural outgrowth of their own bad behavior here below. And we can see this in everyday life with, for instance, people that, end up destroying their relationships, destroying their families, and they end up isolated, alone, and again, living this sort of hellish existence. But unfortunately, in those cases, they are, as it were, their own worst enemy.